I hope we will take that opportunity.
My Lords, I rise to speak to Amendments 56 and 59 in my name. I also support the other amendments in this group. I think these amendments all help to firm up the very good intentions that are set out in clauses 12 and 13 of the bill. In an earlier group, I tabled an amendment to ensure victim support services were properly signposted. It's no use a service existing if the people it's meant to serve are unable to access it. But I think now we come to, if anything, a more fundamental point. How do we ensure the right services for victims exist and exist in each and every part of the country? I think the bill as drafted gets much right. It requires policing bodies, integrated care boards and local authorities to collaborate in assessing the needs of victims, producing a published strategy and indeed revising that strategy as occasion requires. So far so good. But as things stand, and as I think the Noble Lord Russell of Liverpool has indicated, that assessment and that strategy could be little more than a combination of the unaffordable and the non-existent, a bit like an overambitious child's Christmas wish list. And so what I'm trying to do in my two amendments is to seek to plug those gaps. The first simply requires a Secretary of State to ensure that the relevant authorities have the wherewithal to carry out their strategy. As the Noble Lord has just reminded us, Women's Aid estimate the funds required to provide that at £238 million per year. It does sound a lot, but not only would this funding save lives, it would also make even greater savings to society. Sustainably funding specialist support services reduces the need for survivors to use statutory services. It saves money. It helps reduce the staggering economic and social costs of domestic abuse. I think I've seen estimates from the Home Office, is it £78 billion a year? Economic analysis published by Women's Aid found that every pound invested in domestic abuse support is estimated to make at least £9 of savings to the public purse. Until recently, I was chair of a large charitable endowment fund. I can assure Noble Lords that an investment return at that level makes sound financial sense, even before we account for its impact for good on the lives of victims. Then my second amendment gets to the heart of how, in a local area, the commissioning bodies can ensure that a sufficient range and quality of services for victims can be provided in a sustainable way. In 2022, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner found that less than half of survivors who want to access community-based services are able to. And when we look at minoritised women, those seeking support from specialist by and for organisations, those barriers are even greater. 85% of frontline workers surveyed for Refuge's local lifeline support said their service is impacted by insufficient funding. 76% of frontline workers said their caseload had increased in the last year. There's a real risk of services, even where they exist, collapsing under the weight of demand and the shortage of funds. And my Lord, stability is vital for the long-term sustainability of the victim support sector. Community organisations build up levels of trust over time. This allows them to support victims who've often had their ability to trust damaged very severely by the abuse and the criminality that they've suffered. Again, with figures produced by Refuge, some 95% of the survivors they support rely on just such community-based organisations. And the problem is that those organisations are often dependent on short-term grants and they lack long-term stability. So all my amendment is trying to do is to ensure that services commissioned under this clause will be able to have sustainable funding models, allowing for long-term planning and stability, except where that's not necessary. And I've seen too many charitable bodies who spend half their time fighting to win the grants and support for next year's budget, time taken away from actually providing the frontline services they're there to do. I think that would make it easier for organisations to recruit and retain quality staff. Again, it takes a pretty high motivation to stay working any long time for an organisation that's constantly only got a few months of budget left. It'll enable them to develop new resources and, to go back to the point I made earlier, build up the levels of trust that then ensure their work reaches those who really need it and impacts their lives for the better. My Lords, if we can establish this sort of collaboration between statutory and community bodies, supported by government, for the well-being of victims of crime and abuse, we may be going, I think, some way to resurrect what a few years ago the then Prime Minister, now a member of your Lordship's House, so powerfully encouraged us to think of as the big society.